Al-Jazeera just made a video trying to normalize and justify religious apartheid at Al-Aqsa. Let me play the Al-Jazeera video so you can see for yourself how they push these poisonous ideas onto their unsuspecting viewers.
Let's talk about one of the holiest sites in the world. Here's the old city in occupied East Jerusalem.
For thousands of years, there was no such thing as East or West Jerusalem. There was just Jerusalem. This is the city in 1931, before it was cut in half. Back then, Jews were the majority population and had been for generations. In 1844, the Prussian consul recorded 7,120 Jews and 5,000 Muslims residing in the city. And this trend continued for over 100 years. By 1944, Jews made up 2/3 of the city's population. Then overnight, everything changed. In 1948, Israel declared independence and was then invaded by 5 Arab armies. Among them was Jordan, who conquered the old city and expelled its Jewish population. Their commanding officer was Abdullah el-Tel, and he wrote in his memoir that Jerusalem was purged of Jews, and for the first time in 1,000 years, no Jew remained there. Despite Jordan's control over the old city, they were unable to capture several newer neighborhoods outside the city walls. The next year, Israel and Jordan signed a peace agreement which established ceasefire lines known as the 49 Armistice Lines. The Jordanians insisted that the agreement stipulate that they weren't permanent borders, as they hoped to claim more land in the future. The line split Jerusalem into east and west, east with the old city, west with the newer neighborhoods. It wasn't until Israel took back the city in 1967 that it was reunified and the Jews were allowed to return. Most people don't know the history, so they don't see just how deceptive it is for Al Jazeera to label the old city as occupied East Jerusalem. But now that we've set the record straight, we can get back to the video.
There are several sites here that are holy to all three, including this big compound that rises above everything else. Jews call it the Temple Mount. Muslims call it Al-Haram al-Sharif, which means the noble sanctuary, or the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, or sometimes just Al-Aqsa.
The ultimate reason that the Temple Mount holds significance for Christians and Muslims is because of its rich Jewish history. It was the epicenter of the Jewish world, housing the Holy Temple and our national institutions. They then attempt to deceive the viewer by falsely claiming that both Judaism and Islam ban Jews from the Temple Mount.
Now, for most of the last 800 years, the compound was controlled by Muslim rulers and wasn't accessible to non-Muslims.
Sorry, did you catch that?
And wasn't accessible to non-Muslims.
That's not a good thing. They're trying to normalize banning Jews from our holiest site. But what if I were to tell you that the earliest leaders of Islam had a much more inclusive approach? Enter Umar al-Khattab, one of the 4 rightly guided leaders of Islam. After conquering Jerusalem, he welcomed Jews to the Temple Mount. They showed him the location of the temple, helped clear the rubbish from the compound, and prayed there for many years. Surprised? We're only just getting started. Not only did the Jews pray on the Temple Mount, they also had a synagogue on it. Shortly after the conquest of Jerusalem, the Christian chronicler Eusebius reported that the Arabs gave the Jews another area on the Temple Mount for a synagogue. Rabbi Avraham Bachia also confirmed that Muslims had allowed the Jews to build a synagogue there. Even in the restrictive 800-year period that Al Jazeera chose to focus on, there were still times when Jews were able to pray there. The 16th century chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the Radbaz, recorded that Jews regularly visited the Temple Mount, adding, "We have not heard or seen anyone object to this." For political reasons, Al Jazeera are pushing a narrative of exclusion, but the truth is, the earliest leaders of Islam upheld a much more accepting attitude.
Traditionally, Jewish law actually forbids Jews from entering or praying inside the Temple Mount because it's considered so holy, a place of divine presence.
Did she just say we can't pray there?
Jewish law actually forbids Jews from entering or praying inside the Temple Mount.
Jewish law doesn't ban us from praying on the Temple Mount. We're banned from stepping on the exact location where the temple and its inner courtyard stood. This has led some rabbis to rule that Jews shouldn't visit the Temple Mount, as they're not able to determine where the exact location of the temple was. But not all rabbis agree with this. Many of our greatest rabbis allow ascending to the Temple Mount just as long as one is ritually pure and remains in the permitted areas. For example, two renowned rabbis, Maimonides and Nachmanides, both wrote letters describing their experiences of visiting the Temple Mount. Anyway, now that we've rejected a fatwa against Jews praying, let's get back to the video.
So Jews pray outside the compound at the Western Wall, which is thought to have been part of the Second Temple.
Sorry, let me rewind that.
Thought to have been part of the Second Temple.
The Western Wall is often mistaken for the temple, but it's actually one of the retaining walls of the Temple Mount. And the reason that Jews pray there, well, the story behind that might surprise you. After Solomon the Magnificent banned Jews from the Temple Mount, he designated the Western Wall as the official place for Jewish prayer, which is why it became the main gathering place for Jews to pray. When Israel liberated Jerusalem, a fateful decision was made to allow the Jordanian Waqf to keep control over the Temple Mount. This has been a disaster for religious Jews.
And that whole arrangement is wrapped up in this idea known as the status quo. It's a Latin phrase which means the situation as it is now. But in this context, the status quo refers to how things are done at Al-Aqsa.
Very simple. Muslims pray, non-Muslims visit. Full stop. Holy Esplanade, Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount is exclusively a place of worship for Muslims.
This is a stark demonstration of inequality. While all faiths are free to offer their prayers at the Western Wall, disgracefully, Jews and Christians are denied the right to pray on the Temple Mount. This is what religious apartheid looks like.
So there are lots of ways that the status quo has been violated. Restrictions on Muslim worship, which is something that the Israeli occupation imposes quite frequently. Sometimes age restrictions, usually limiting men of a certain age from entering the site if they feel that there may be protests or something happening.
This is insane. Over 1 million Muslims pray on the Temple Mount every year. Israel only restricts access during times of violent unrest, and only then for young men of fighting age. And yet Al-Jazeera has the audacity to make this video trying to justify and normalize banning Jews from the Temple Mount, but they feign outrage when Israel temporarily limits access during violent riots.
We're also seeing more Jewish prayer, whether it's silent, but slowly it's becoming much more overt now.
There is Jewish prayer. I've seen it daily.
I'm kind of lost for words right now. It's genuinely hard for me to believe that there are people who get angry at the sight of us praying. They get angry because Jews pray. Seriously, could you imagine having that much internalized hate that you support banning Jews from our most sacred site? Actually, it's worse than that. They don't just support banning us, but they get visibly triggered when we pray there. The Temple Mount should be a place of peace, not a site of conflict and discrimination. If you want to help us make more videos like this, you can support us on Patreon or you can purchase our merch.